Not sure if I've got the right map. This is, which one is it? That's Norfolk. I'm not in Norfolk. I'm coming into Brighton and Hove. Now, just navigating, coming into Sussex, coming into Hurstfield Point. I'm coming down. I'm landing, but the wind, it's very windy and I'm flying into the sun. It's quite hard to see. I think I nearly made it. I'm on the runway. I'm coming down at the controls, and it's a bumpy landing. But here we are. Hooray! Aviatrixes in fiction. Tonight I'm going to be celebrating with you. And strange noises in a scary way. Not sure what's going on there. Hope it's nothing to do with my aeroplane. So the reason that I came to want to do this topic is because I've recently read two fantastic books, one of which was only very recently published, which is Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead. And this was actually on the shortlist for the Booker Prize. The other one is a book that was published a while back, which is I Was Amelia Earhart by Jane Mandelsson. And I'm going to be talking to you about both of these books this evening. But when I started thinking about this topic, I didn't realise quite how many female aviatrixes there are in the world, and there have been. And also, verily, they've been written about a lot in both fiction and non-fiction. More in non-fiction than fiction, it has to be said. These are the two main brilliant novels that I've read about aviatrixes. Don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. And I'd actually like to start this evening's session with a quote. "Once you have tasted flight, you will forever walk the earth with your eyes turned skyward, for there you have been, and there you will always long to return." Leonardo da Vinci. And I'd like to thank enormously Kim, the female pilot who works for TAP, which is Air Portugal. And she's based in Lisbon and might be watching tonight, but she might not because she's on standby duty, ironically. And I'm really thrilled that Kim found my bibliotherapy sessions, and is a female pilot. And she told me, just trying to get a bit of air in this skull cap, which is actually quite difficult to hear through. Laughing John, great to see you. I hope that you're not literally taking off and that you can stay with me for tonight's session, which is going to be a really fun one, and we are all going to be taking off at the end of it into the skies. So Kim, thank you so much for finding me. I hope you're watching tonight, and if not, you can watch later. But Kim told me that still only 3% of pilots are women. Why is this? Nobody knows. She doesn't have an answer for us for that. And I wonder if anyone else has that answer. Is it simply just that boys dream of being pilots and girls don't? Is it that it's a very sexist world that we still live in? We know that it was when the profession began. And I also have a particular interest in female pilots because my mum did learn to fly when she was in South Africa. She only had a few flying lessons. She was in her 20s when she lived in South Africa, and she was a mother of 4, so she didn't have a huge amount of time, but she did love flying. But later in her life, she got vertigo, and I think that's why she didn't pursue flying hugely. I've also gone paragliding, which I absolutely loved, and it did make me see the world differently, as Leonardo da Vinci said. I've never quite seen the world in the same way since. And I've also got some amazing letters from my grandmother, which I really wanted to find to show you tonight, but I've put them somewhere really safely in a box, which talk about when my mum was born, and they lived in India because my grandmother was part of the British Army in India. And she talks about seeing friends of theirs circling over their garden in tiny aeroplanes and waving at them, and then coming and joining them for a cup of tea. How fantastic is that? I love the way in those days just getting in an aeroplane seemed rather like the way that we get into a car now. And if only it was still like that. I know that there's all sorts of ways that that would not work, but it is a fantastic idea. And also my friend Susan Aldekin, who I wrote the novel Cure with, her husband is a pilot, and they regularly go flying, or they used to much more when they lived in America. So Suze has also been flying a lot around the United States and has reported some amazing adventures in an aeroplane. So essentially, I really want to be a female pilot, as you can tell by my garb, and I'm going to do my utmost to get into the sky this year, one way or another. And thanks for appreciating the costume. Thanks, Zoe, also for lending me this fabulous flying jacket. I'm very much going to take to this aeronautical look this year, I feel. So I want to start, before talking about the brilliant female pilots in fiction, I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction to books for children about female pilots, because as Laughing John so rightly points out, we want more female pilots in the world. And the best way to do that is to give girls books all about female pilots to inspire them and get them into the mindset that they can be pilots just as much as boys can. So we'd start with a book called Brave Harriet, which is recommended for ages 5 to 8, which is all about a real aviatrix in 1912, Harriet Quimby, who knew that she wanted to become the first woman to fly solo across the English Channel, even though airplanes in those days were rickety, unreliable things. Even over such a short distance of going over the English Channel, the risks were high. If she veered off course for even 5 miles, she would fly out over the ocean and run out of fuel far from shore. Luckily, her flight was a success, but another news story, the sinking of the Titanic, overtook her accomplishment, at least for others, though for Quimby herself it was a dream come true. The celebration of this little known moment in aviation history will make kids consider how famous Harriet Quimby should have been. So there's a lot of female pilots which have sadly been forgotten, and we should really try and find out more about them, which is why I'm celebrating this evening. And actually, on that note, I'd also like to give a shout out to Gavin Jameson, who very kindly pointed out to me tonight the famous aviatrix Winifred Spooner, who was an amazing female pilot, who was en route to Cairo with Gavin's wife's great uncle when the plane fell into the Mediterranean. I don't know quite how, don't know the whole story. And she had to swim a mile in order to get help, and succeeded in getting help. So hats off to Winifred Spooner. We would love to hear more about her another time. And if you do follow me on Twitter, Gavin Jameson was tweeting me about that this evening, and he's put a really fantastic picture of the people involved in that incident on Twitter. So go and have a look. So another book for girls to read, ages about 5 to 9, is a book called Machine by Heather Lang, which is all about Ruth Law, who set off on the first non-stop Chicago to New York City flight on November the 19th, 1916. A flight the experts thought was doomed. Exposed to the wind and cold in the seat of her little biplane, and then facing another challenge when her engine ran out of fuel, Law managed to glide safely into Hornell, New York, short of her goal, but still setting a new record for cross-country flight distance. And despite the stop, she was greeted by thrilled crowds after refueling and finishing her trip to New York City. This exciting and action-packed story will leave young aviation enthusiasts fascinated and dying to get into the hot seat of an aeroplane, just like me. Can I read through these goggles? I'll give it a go. Another one, another brilliant book for kids, roughly 5 to 9. Obviously, boys and girls should both read these. Is The Fearless Flight of Hazel Yingli. Hazel Yingli was one of 8 siblings, but everyone agreed she was the fearless one. And when she took her first ride in an aeroplane at the age of 19, she knew she wanted to be a pilot. I think it just gets some people like that. They know from a young age that that's their destiny. Though Kim, the pilot that I met recently on Instagram, she said that she would never have dreamed of being a pilot when she was 15. So I'm dying to hear her story. How did she become a pilot? Hopefully I'll find out one day. In a time when women didn't fly, Chinese Americans were required to carry identification at all times. Being a pilot seemed out of reach for young Hazel Yingli, and her mother thought it wouldn't be ladylike. Lee disagreed, and when the Women Air Force Service pilots were established during World War II, she finally got the chance to achieve her dream. This picture book biography of the first Chinese American woman to fly for the US military is a celebration of passion and a tribute to the groundbreaking woman who refused to take no for an answer. And that's Hazel Yingli. And it's another fantastic picture book. All of these books that I'm talking about, I'm afraid I don't have to show you, but they're amazing, beautiful looking picture books, which would be great for any young reader or even adult reader. There's another one, same age group, called Me in the Sky, Captain Beverly Bass, Pioneering Pilot. Beverly Bass, when she was a girl in the late 1950s, dreamed of being a pilot, but her parents told her girls just don't do that. However, they supported her by taking her to an airport to watch the planes. As a teenager, she got her pilot's license and fought through decades of prejudice before getting her big break with American Airlines. She was one of the pilots forced to land in Gander, Newfoundland on September the 11th, 2001, which brought her story to the world through the hit musical Come From Away. This vivacious biography, told by Bass herself, is a soaring tale of refusing to give up on your dreams. There's a lot of these amazing books about female pilots for kids, which I never knew about until I started researching this topic, and I'm really pleased to have found them. One that I love the look of is Wood, Wire and Wings. Emma Lillian Todd invents an aeroplane. Don't we all wish that we'd done that? I actually did want to build my own hot air balloon when I was a teenager. Haven't done it yet. Maybe there's still time and I can still go up in that machine with my special goggles on. Wood, Wire and Wings by Emma Lillian Todd. Sorry, about Emma Lillian Todd. It's written by Kirsten W. Larson. Emma Lillian Todd loved tinkering. Even as a child, she took apart clocks and reassembled them to figure out how they worked. As an adult, she worked at the patent office, typing up patents for other inventors and imagining how she could improve them. In the early 1900s, most people didn't think women could be inventors, but Lillian was determined to prove them wrong by designing her very own airplane. This riveting picture book biography brings to life a nearly forgotten engineer whose visionary thinking and determination helped her groundbreaking invention take flight. Then we've got Nerves of Steel, the incredible true story of how one woman followed her dreams, stayed true to herself, and saved 148 lives. Young readers will be thrilled at the story of pilot Tammie Jo Shultz, the groundbreaking Navy pilot whose calm thinking and razor-sharp skills saved the lives of 148 people on Southwest Flight 1380 on April the 17th, 2018. Tammie Jo had to stay true to her dream of becoming a pilot as she faced obstacles and challenges along the way. But eventually, she was one of the first women to fly the FA-18 Hornet for the Navy. That same determination helped her keep her cool when a catastrophic engine failure threatened the lives of everyone on board her Southwest Airlines plane. This young reader's adaptation of Schultz's book, Nerves of Steel, will remind readers to have faith in themselves and to pursue their dreams. So you can also read the adult version of this book, Nerves of Steel, which is equally brilliant and fascinating and goes into more detail. We've also got another great book called Fly Girls, the daring American women pilots who helped win World War II. That's all about the US Army Air Force facing a shortage of pilots in the middle of World War II, and they called upon a group of women to help. The 1,100 women of the Women Air Force Service pilots, WASPs, were trained like military pilots, marching in review and wearing uniforms. So a number of them died in the line of duty, but because they were only civilians, they received no military benefits, not even for burials. In this inspiring book, author Patricia Pearson creates a lively account of the daring women whose love of flying and desire to serve their country drove them to soar and challenge the sexist attitudes of their time. So we've just got a couple more of these lovely children's books that I'm telling you about. And then I'm going to be moving on to tell you a bit more about some of the amazing female pilots, both in non-fiction and fiction. Seized by the Sun, the life and disappearance of World War II pilot Gertrude Tompkins. This is a book for young readers aged 13 and up. It's a young adult novel all about Gertrude Tompkins, who joined the Women Air Force Service Pilots, WASPs again, to overcome her grief over the death of the love of her life. Learning to fly freed her from that and from the stutter that had plagued her throughout her life. But after lifting off for a mission on October the 26th, 1944, the 32-year-old pilot disappeared. She remains the only WASP still missing, and what happened to her remains a mystery. In this fascinating book from the Women of Action series, which by the way has a lot of amazing other books all about women of action, author James Ure draws on years of research to create a complex portrait of this daring woman and her tragic end. No one's ever found her, nobody knows what's happened to her. And this is a common theme in both fiction and non-fiction with aviatrixes, because they do disappear tragically, sometimes because, well, always because they've flown somewhere previously uncharted. And then the question is, did they live? Did they disappear deliberately? Or did they in fact die? And both of these books, the novels that I'm going to be talking about later, involve aviatrixes who disappeared. Then moving on to another kids' book, aged 5 to 9, Aim for the Skies by Amy Bissonnette. Jerry Mock and Joan Miriam Smith's race to complete Amelia Earhart's quest. We'll be hearing a lot more about Amelia Earhart soon. Growing up, both Geraldine Jerry Mock and Joan Miriam decided they wanted to be pilots, and both of them were inspired by trailblazing pilot Amelia Earhart. In the 1960s, both women decided independently that they wanted to follow Earhart's planned route and circle the world. They even planned their starts for the same day, by chance. That's pretty weird. When the news broke, there was only one option for the media and public, transfixed by their story, to turn their flights into a race. Mock would end up winning, but both women would end up fulfilling the dream of a lifetime. This picture book about the 1964 race between Mock and Miriam will introduce young readers to two little-known but important figures in aviation history. So that's a roundup of rather brilliant kids' books to inspire girls to fly. I feel sure that most aviatrixes in the 1930s would have had really impractical glasses like this next to them in their plane so that they could have a drink of water or probably something stronger. I'm just going to have a little sip. It's thirsty work when you're going round the world, which is what I'm doing. Just having a little stop off in Sussex this evening. So another slight leap in a different direction temporarily on the theme of women who fly is an interesting book called Women Who Fly, Goddesses, Witches, Mystics and Other Airborne Females. And I wish I could show you the cover of it because it's got a great picture of a floating woman on it who looks very mystical and quite spooky. And this is a book, as you can imagine from the title, which is all about female flight in popular culture and history. So we're talking about witches, we're talking about brooms, we're talking about wings, mental transcendence, or in the cockpit of a Spitfire, of course. And all of these ideas of female flight have threatened the patriarchy in the history of Europe and the wider world while liberating women. Even today, flighty women are still considered in negative terms. If you think about that language, being flighty is seen as being unreliable and a little bit worrying. So this book, Women Who Fly, Goddesses, Witches, Mystics and Other Airborne Females, explores prejudices around aerial females and gives you quite a lot of interesting folklore all about them. So if you're interested in that side of things as well, that would be a whole new topic that I will cover at some point, flying women who are not flying aeroplanes but who are simply flying, because that's a rich source of great ideas in literature too. We'll do that sometime in 2022. So another non-fiction book about women and flying is Magnificent Women and Flying Machines, the first 200 years of British women in the sky. This is another lovely coffee table type book. Entertaining and detailed personal stories of women determined to get airborne, either because they're fascinated by the new ideas of ballooning or parachuting, or having come from a poor background, they seized an opportunity of the moment and were rewarded for taking risks at public displays. These were the equivalent of the extreme sports of today, some would say. So this is written by an author who's a balloonist and conveys the particulars of early flight. So you can see the hair-raising risks developing, which result in some tragic, but also some hilarious accidents. We're talking about flights over the last 200 years with women, and it's a pretty exciting roundup of British aviatrixes. I'd just like to put in a word for the first African female pilot, Melody Millicent Danquah, who was born on the 6th of January 1937 and died in 2016. She was a Ghanaian pilot and the first female pilot in Africa. She was chosen among the first of 3 women towards the end of 1963 to be trained into the Ghanaian Air Force as pilots. She successfully made the grade and then had basic military training, becoming the first Ghanaian to fly an aeroplane solo. So that's Melody Millicent Danquah, the first Ghanaian pilot. And as far as I know, nobody's written a book about her yet, and surely they should. Then a little brief history of aviatrixes, which is a word which I'm never quite going to get right, before we talk about female pilots in fiction. The first machine-powered flight by humans, if we are to believe history, not mythology, and think about Daedalus and Icarus, occurred on December the 17th, 1903, with the Wright brothers. But it's appropriate to begin this session with an almost forgotten contributor to that great event, their sister, Catherine Wright, who gave them enormous financial and moral support, providing them with the means to actually go forth and fly. And her brother Wilbur said, to his credit, if ever the world thinks of us in connection with aviation, we must remember our sister. Catherine Wright first flew with her brothers for their demonstration flights in France in 1909. Catherine could have been the inspiration for the Baroness Raymonde de la Roche of France, who was the first woman in the world to solo in 1909 and the first woman in the world to earn her pilot's license in 1910. So that is 112 years ago. The first woman in the world earned her first pilot's license. That's pretty amazing. After watching some of the early flying exhibitions by the Baroness de la Roche, Bessie Coleman returned to America with her French husband, and they began building aircraft in their living room. She's given credit for being the first American woman to solo on September 16th, 1910, in one of the aircraft she and her husband built. In their very own living room. They must have had a big living room. Blanche Stewart Scott was technically the first American woman to solo when a block of her aircraft's throttle jolted out of place and she went airborne on September the 2nd, 1910. She was not credited with being the first American woman to solo by the Aeronautical Society of America because the flight was ruled accidental. That's annoying, isn't it? And it might have been a little bit sexist as well. Harriet Quimby, we've mentioned before because one of the children's books about her, was the first American woman to earn a pilot's license in 1911. And the second woman in the world to do so. She was killed in an aircraft accident in 1912, which is rather tragic. Sadly, in those days, this was not uncommon. Harriet Quimby's friend, Matilda Mossong, was the second American woman to earn a pilot's license. She also set several altitude records and was the first person of either gender to land a plane in Mexico City. Imagine those days when you were the first person to land an aeroplane anywhere. And probably that was true of my grandparents' times when they were watching those aeroplanes circling around in India. Some of those places would have been the first time that an aeroplane had ever been seen. Catherine Stinson was the first woman to fly the Mail and the first woman in the world to own a flying school. That's pretty amazing. I didn't know that even happened in those days. In 1913, Catherine and her mother created Stinson Aviation Company to rent and sell aeroplanes. In 1917, Catherine toured Asia and was the first woman to fly in Japan or China. Catherine's younger sister, Marjorie Stenson, was employed by her sister's flying school as their chief instructor. All these amazing women, these Stinsons. I'd love to know more about them. Ruth Law was the first woman to fly at night in 1913 and the first woman to loop the loop. 3 years later, she broke the world's non-stop cross-country record for men or women by flying 590 miles from Chicago, Illinois to Hornell, New York. 590 miles non-stop in 1913. That is incredible and terrifying. And we will have more of such stories when we come to the fiction soon. Just a tiny bit more of the old history, and then we'll be getting into the joys of fiction. As you can see from my research, I found a hell of a lot more than I was bargaining for when I started going down this incredibly exciting aeronautical route. And I never knew that there were so many women pilots, not only now, obviously there's still not as many as we'd like, but in those days, those early pioneering days of the 1910s, 1920s and 1930s, who knew that there were even women actually teaching flying to whole rafts of other people, which is pretty fantastic to know. So Bessie Coleman was the first African American to earn a pilot's license. That's the first African American of either gender, and this is in the 1920s. But she had to travel to France to do so because none of the American schools would train a black person. She earned her pilot's license in France in 1921, returned to America, and took up stunt flying to earn money. How cool is that, Bessie Coleman? Let's hear it for her. She died while test flying her newly delivered aircraft in 1926, the day prior to a flying event scheduled in Florida. That's so tragic. In 1931, Ruth Nichols attempted to be the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic, a flight aborted by engine failure, but it did net her the women's altitude record. Later that year, she broke Pancho Barnes's speed record. She founded Relief Wings in 1939 to coordinate private aircraft for emergency and disaster relief. This is Ruth Nichols. Nichols, what an incredibly cool woman she was too. Her contribution to winning World War II was in offering the services of Relief Wings to the Civil Air Patrol in 1942. What an absolute dude she was. Lady Mary Bailey. Damien, great to see you. I'm so dressed to fly. I am intermittently putting the goggles on when I'm flying through a bit of difficulties in the clouds, but it does make reading a little bit difficult, so I will take them off once more. So Lady Mary Bailey of Ireland earned her pilot's license in 1926 and immediately flew the Irish Sea. She became the first woman to qualify for a blind flying certificate. 2 years later, she left London on a solo flight to Cape Town, South Africa, and returned solo via the west coast of Africa. All these solo women travellers, I can't quite believe them, flying hundreds of miles, 550 miles on their own. They were so daring and incredible. And I just wonder if that still can happen in this day and age. I'd love to hear from any female pilots out there who have taken such adventures. Kim, if you're listening tonight, we'd love to hear from you. We'd really like to know about your Aviatrix adventures in real life. Kim is a pilot who I recently met on Instagram, who comes to my bibliotherapy live sessions to my joy, and she discovered that I was doing this session about aviatrixes in fiction, and she did say she might not be able to join us tonight because she's on standby to fly. Kim, we're dying to hear from you, and if you're flying right now, good luck to you. But I'd really love to hear from you, Kim, if you can come back and tell me about your flying adventures and how you actually became a pilot. Because Kim did say on our Instagram chat that she had not been encouraged to do anything adventurous when she was young, and she never would have imagined that she could have become a pilot. So I really want to know how that adventure happened. Anyway, carrying on with some of these amazing pilots, Phoebe Omley was the first person to earn a transport license in 1927. In 1930, she won the Dixie Derby Air Race, and then in 1931, she won the National Air Races in Cleveland, the first year women were admitted to the race. She went to Washington, D.C. as the private flying specialist for the Civil Aeronautics Authority to help the country prepare for World War II, where she chose flying schools that could serve as training centres for military flyers. She tried to convince the CAA to use women as flight instructors, but they turned her down. She took her proposal to the Tennessee Bureau of Aeronautics, and they accepted it, prompting other states to do so. So Phoebe Omley was clearly a pretty amazing woman too, and she did her best to get women flying and to teach women flying. She was clearly thwarted by sexism at the time, but she did at least get her proposal taken to Tennessee, where she then taught lots of women to fly. So hurrah for Phoebe Omley. So many amazing women that we really need to hear more about. Then the woman who is most famous and who actually brought me to this session tonight is Amelia Earhart, who is probably most famous, not simply because she was an amazing aviatrix, but it is sadly because she disappeared in real life. And we're going to talk about this book in a minute. But in 1928, Amelia Earhart became the first woman to fly across the Atlantic as a passenger. She gained fame from this, but it was by no means her most significant contribution to aviation. She became the first woman to fly across the Atlantic solo in 1932. And then in 1935, she became the first person to fly solo across the Pacific from Honolulu to Oakland. 2 years later, Amelia and her navigator, Fred Noonan, began their round-the-world flight from Miami eastward. After completing 22,000 miles of their journey, they were last seen on takeoff from Lae, New Guinea on July the 2nd, 1937. She was truly an inspiration to women. Her attitude towards success and failure summed up in the following quote: "Women must try to do things as men have tried. When they fail, their failure must be but a challenge to others." So I'm now going to talk about Amelia Earhart and this brilliant book, because although there are many more fantastic female pilots to talk about, I realise that I'm not going to have time to touch on them all. So I will now move on to the amazingness of Amelia Earhart, and I'm just trying to find my blurb about her. So this book, I Was Amelia Earhart by Jane Mandelsson, is a book that I must admit I put off reading for a long time because it's quite a dull looking cover. I hate to be someone that judges a book by the cover. I know, it's a bit embarrassing. But I had been hugely recommended it by my great and wonderful friend Susan Aldekin. So I knew it was going to be brilliant. But I also knew that it was very poetic and written in a slightly unusual style. So I put off reading it to start with. And it did take a little bit of getting into at first. But then I became absolutely hooked. And I now completely see why Susan was raving about it to me quite so much. Because it is an amazing, brilliant, and very captivating, very romantic book. And the central premise of the book is that it's written by Amelia Earhart, who has survived her crash. So it's written in her voice. Intriguingly, it's written partly in the third person. So there's a sort of omniscient narrator talking about her, and partly in her own first person voice. And it starts off telling us about her childhood, about how she became a pilot, and then we live through the crash that she has with Fred Noonan, her navigator, who she didn't really like and who was an alcoholic. And they land on this island in the middle of nowhere, which they call heaven, ironically. And they actually both go slightly mad at first and avoid each other. But then they slowly fall in love. And it's actually such a romantic story. I utterly recommend it to everyone. It's a great book to read now. It's very good to read if you're feeling a bit alienated from people, or if you actually want to be alone, because the central idea of the book is that Amelia Earhart has had enough of being incredibly famous and having to do things expected of her. And she's actually really happy to end up on this little atoll on a tiny island with her navigator. And they have a huge amount of sex and a really great time on the sands of the island over a long period. And I won't tell you what happens at the end because I don't want to give it away, but it's just a great read. I'm going to read you a couple of sections from it so that you get an idea of the way it's written. "I always hated wearing goggles, but I wear them when I have to. And that day, the last day, the day the sky is flesh, I'm wearing goggles and a leather skull cap and a scarf around my neck. I put on the goggles only when absolutely necessary, and I never put them on before I get into the cockpit, and I take them off before I climb out of the hatch. Ever since I've been famous, which has been a long time now, I've taken great care with my personal style. I wear my hair short. I like it that way, and I smile with my lips closed. The way GP taught me. I'm not very good at that. After I flew across the Atlantic and became famous, GP decided to mould me into a star. He told me how to eat, how to speak, how to dress, how to smile with my mouth closed for the cameras. He told me not to wear hats with feathers or brims, but I ignored him whenever I could. On the plane that day, I'm wearing my typical uniform of brown leather pants and a white silk shirt. I've been flying for weeks, with only a change of clothes, but I still look fashionable. No one wore leather and silk with as much glamorous nonchalance. The look is my own. I invented it for myself long before I met GP, when I was first learning how to fly. I wanted the other pilots to take me seriously, but I was a society girl, a fallen socialite from unexceptional circumstances, but still they were sceptical of me, and I wanted desperately to impress them. This was the time in my life when I cut my long golden hair until it was short, and then I curled it. It was also the time when I bought a leather coat to fit in with the crowd at the airfield. I slept in it the first night I bought it because I loved it and because I wanted to break it in. Then I splattered it with oil on purpose to make stains. So she does sound quite uptight, I must admit, and a bit full of herself. By the way, Amelia Earhart was an ultra fashion icon. You can kind of tell from there that she did care about what she wore. And she actually had her own fashion label, and rather wonderfully, she created quite a lot of her fashion from parachute silk and other aviation related materials. And they were also quite radical because they were more practical than many of the items that women used to wear in those days. She created, she said, fashion for women to actually wear for when they were trying to be active. It was fashion for the active woman. And I just want to read you a little bit more because you can see that this is one of those books when you pick it up, practically every paragraph is a book that you want to share and read with other people. But I'm not going to have time to do that, so I'll just read you a couple of other bits just to give you a little bit more of a flavour of the marvellousness of this book. I've had lovers. I've had a husband. My husband proposed to me 6 times before I could accept. And then when I finally did accept, I wrote him a letter asking him to promise to let me go. Let me go in a year if I'm unhappy, I said. It sounded so grave, but I was only being practical. The idea that we would be bound together irrevocably seemed ridiculous, but I was not in love. I remember the first time I met my husband, I couldn't stand him. He was arrogant. He held the door open for me with his whole arm. He was interviewing me for a job. The job was to be the first woman to fly across the Atlantic. The plane was going to be flown by a man, but they wanted a woman to sit in the plane to make the record for publicity purposes. They wanted me as baggage. I knew I could fly the plane by myself, but I had to accept their terms. I wasn't going to have a career as a pilot any other way. I wasn't rich. Most of the other women flying planes were wealthy. As my future husband pointed out to me, if I went, and if the flight was successful, there would be other opportunities. He glanced at his gold watch. He was a man who understood opportunity. Sometimes it seemed as if he had invented the very idea. He was right, of course. Later, I flew the Atlantic myself, then the Pacific. But the first time, I just went along for the ride. I'm just going to read you a tiny bit more, just the last little bit, which is towards the end, because I want to give you an idea of the loveliness of being on the island with Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan, her navigator, because it is unlike any other story I've ever read, in that she really does love solitude, and she writes about it really beautifully, and she revels in the joys of not being famous in a way that only someone who has been incredibly famous can. In the Electra, the light is blue. The Electra is the name of her aeroplane that has crashed on the atoll where they're now stranded. There's a smell of gasoline. The heat is heavy. There are no windows that open. So I leave the hatch up, but still the air is stifling. I think maybe that he never said it, but that I only heard him say it in silence. We were looking at each other very hard, and I heard him say it without speaking, and I said it too. His words entered my heart, soundless, directly. There is a time known as the Between. The Between voyager travels through uncharted territory, navigating dangers, attempting a passage into the next life. There are times in life, after a death of some kind, when we are open to the slightest shifts, when our powers are acute, when we can change the future. The Between voyager temporarily possesses an immensely heightened intelligence, extraordinary powers of concentration, special abilities of clairvoyance and teleportation, flexibility to become whatever can be imagined, and the openness to be radically transformed by a thought or a vision or an instruction. More people should know this. We should be taught this. This time never announces itself, never tells us it is here or coming. But there are signs and ways of preparing. Life is the preparation. I had been risking my life without living it before, so I wasn't fully prepared when my time came. But I had a navigator. And so when my time came again, a second time, I was prepared. Planes used to be vehicles for dreaming. They were strong and curvaceous, manly and womanly at the same time, simple, almost old-fashioned, mechanical toys and vessels carrying the future. As soon as you saw a plane, you started dreaming. It was a thrill just to catch a glimpse of one. In Los Angeles, on hot nights, we used to drive out to the airfield and watch the military pilots practicing, just landing and taking off. We did it to get away from the heat and to dream even when we couldn't sleep. Large parts of the world were without airplanes. Back then, and it's not that long ago, most people in the world had never seen a plane, let alone been up in one. So that's a section incredibly close to the end, and it's when things are all getting, in a way, a bit mystical. I would very much recommend I Was Amelia Earhart. It's a book that does give you a different view on the great heroine, which she kind of calls herself. She always wanted to be a great heroine, according to Jane Mandelsson. And this is a book which is fictionalized, but very much based on real life as well. And she did actually base quite a lot of what she wrote on Amelia Earhart's own writing, because, amazingly enough, Amelia Earhart actually wrote 3 books herself, which you can also read. They are The Fun of It, which she wrote in 1932, which is, she wrote one before that. So she wrote 20 Hours, 40 Minutes, which was published in 1928, which is all about her experiences as a passenger in the Friendship, which made her the first woman to cross the Atlantic Ocean. That's when she was being baggage, as she puts it in the fictional book. And she combines actual log entries made during the flight with recollections of her childhood and how she first became interested in aviation. She also, there's a really great quote from this book, which I'll quickly share with you. She says, possibly the feature of aviation which may appeal most to thoughtful women is its potentiality for peace. The term is not merely an airy phrase. Isolation breeds distrust and differences of outlook. Anything which tends to annihilate distance destroys isolation and brings the world and its peoples closer together. I think aviation has a chance to increase intimacy, understanding, and far-flung friendships. Thus, that's a rather interesting and great paragraph from Amelia Earhart's first book, 20 Hours, 40 Minutes. She then wrote The Fun of It in 1932, which was her recollections of how she became interested in being an aviator, and the very many firsts that she made as a first for women. And she also became the aviation editor for Cosmopolitan magazine, which she talks about in this book. And then finally, her last book was called Last Flight, which was published posthumously and published in 1937. Although, was she still alive? Possibly living with Fred Noonan in a beautiful island. Let's hope she was. And it's slightly disputed as to whether she did write all of this or whether her husband actually wrote a lot of it on her behalf, because he claimed to be using her diaries and logbooks, but he could have actually added a lot of it himself. However, I've still got 2 books to talk about and I've only got 10 minutes. So, West with the Night by Beryl Markham, which again, thanks to Kay, the amazing pilot, for reminding me about this book. This book by Beryl Markham is all about Markham's amazing life, who was herself an amazing aviatrix, and it's non-fiction, but it's written in a very beautiful way. So Markham was taken to Kenya at the age of 4. As an adult, she was befriended by Dennis Finch Hatton, the big game hunter from out of Africa. And Colleen is saying she's such a legend, so you know about her too. I must admit, I didn't know about her until I started researching this topic. So I'm glad that she's a legend to you as well. So she was taken flying by Dennis Finch Hatton, the big game hunter, who became famous from the novel Out of Africa. And Markham was thrilled by the experience, went on to become the first woman in Africa to receive a commercial pilot's license. In 1936, she determined to fly solo across the Atlantic without stopping. When Charles Lindbergh did the same, he had the wind behind him, but Markham, by contrast, had a strong headwind against her and a plane that only flew up to 163 mph. On the 4th of September, she took off. Several days later, she crash landed in Nova Scotia and became an instant celebrity. That's Beryl Markham, whose book West with the Night is an absolutely brilliant non-fiction book about her experiences, and it was actually on the best-selling lists when it came out in the 1930s for several months running, so it was obviously popular even then and deserves to be still read now. Here's a quote from Beryl Markham from that book. I have learned that if you must leave a place that you have lived in and loved, and where all your yesteryears are buried deep, leave it anyway except a slow way. Leave it the fastest way you can. Never turn back, and never believe that an hour you remember is a better hour because it is dead. Past years seem safe ones, vanquished ones, while the future lives in a cloud, formidable from a distance. A couple of other quotes from Beryl Markham, because she does write beautifully. I love this one. A map says to you, read me carefully, follow me closely, doubt me not. I am the earth in the palm of your hand. And one more about silence, which actually is written about very beautifully in the Amelia Earhart book too. There are all kinds of silences, and each of them means a different thing. There is the silence that comes with morning in a forest, and this is different from the silence of a sleeping city. There is silence after a rainstorm and before a rainstorm, and these are not the same. There is the silence of emptiness, the silence of fear, the silence of doubt. There is a certain silence that can emanate from a lifeless object, as from a chair lately used, or from a piano with old dust upon its keys, or from anything that has answered to the need of a man for pleasure or for work. This kind of silence can speak. Its voice may be melancholy, but it is not always so, for the chair may have been left by a laughing child, or the last notes of the piano may have been raucous and gay. Whatever the mood or the circumstance, the essence of its quality may linger in the silence that follows. It is a soundless echo. That's rather beautiful and lovely. Many of these amazing aviatrices were also amazing writers and philosophers. One more from Beryl Markham, which I also love because it's about flying. We fly, but we have not conquered the air. Nature presides in all her dignity, permitting us the study and the use of such of her forces as we may understand. It is when we presume to intimacy, having been granted only tolerance, that the harsh stick fall across our impudent knuckles, and we rub the pain, staring upward, startled by our ignorance. There we go. So that's Beryl Markham, a legend of her time. And now, with very little time to spare, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Maggie Shipstead's book, Great Circle, which is the book that got me started down this rabbit hole of amazing aviatrixes. So this was shortlisted for the Booker Prize this year, and it's all about a female pilot whose name is Marilyn. Sorry, now I'm going to get it wrong. Marion Graves, who has always been marked by lust for freedom and danger. It's a big, epic book, and it's a really great read, which I did hugely enjoy. And it's particularly interesting because it does use the real history of aviation and the true history of women pilots. It definitely has strong resemblances to the real life of Amelia Earhart, because the heroine Marion goes through quite a lot of similar situations. Her adopted father is a drunk, which Amelia Earhart's also was. Marion in this book has a very difficult childhood. She's very poor, and she has to find ways of making a living because her adopted father gambles all their money away. And she falls in love with the idea of aviation when she's only 12, when an aeroplane flies so close to her on the ground that she felt like she could have touched its wing, and she's mesmerized by this aeroplane and immediately knows that she must fly. So she dedicates her life to becoming a pilot, but it takes a long time. She has to become a bootlegger. She has to marry an awful, abusive man who is the one that actually funds her to become a pilot. He loves her in a rather twisted way, and she is enabled to be a pilot because he has money. Meanwhile, there's also another layer of the book, which is half a century later. So the Marion story is going from kind of the 1930s to the 1960s. And half a century later, we have a parallel story which is written throughout the book about Hadley Baxter, who is a brilliant and troubled Hollywood starlet who is irresistibly drawn to the idea of playing Marion Graves, the Aviatrix, in a role that will lead her to probe her very own darkest secrets. So Hadley actually lost her own parents when they fell into a lake from a small plane, or rather the whole plane crashed into the lake, and that happens at the beginning of the book, so I'm not giving anything away. And she is united with Marion Graves in their orphanhood because Marion Graves also lost her parents at a very young age in a boat, and Marion Graves's father was he deserted his own ship in order to save his children. So there's a lot of drama going on in this fantastic novel, which you can tell because, well, it all begins at the beginning. There's huge amounts of drama, and it carries on throughout the book. There's really never a dull moment, and it is really great the way Maggie Shipstead splices the two aspects of the book together: the modern Hadley with the more historical Marion. And to revert back to the Earhart story as well, Marion's trajectory does take a very similar journey when she goes on her own great circle, deciding to travel around the world, around the circumference of the world, with her own navigator, who is also an alcoholic, and probably does bear quite a lot of similarities to Fred Noonan. And in fact, Maggie Shipstead did a huge amount of research in order to follow this imaginary journey, which is imaginary. It's actually not based on a true story, but it does bear a lot of relationships to the true stories of Amelia Earhart and other aviatrixes of the time. Anyway, it's all highly dramatic, very exciting. It is long. It does have moments of non-drama, but it's always a really great read, and it's really fun, and it's also brilliantly written, and I am a big fan of Maggie Shipstead. So all in all, it's a brilliant read. I thoroughly recommend it, and I don't have time to read you a section because I've run out of time. Cheers to all of you. And thank you so much for joining me this evening. Laughing John, thanks so much for loving my outfit and urging me to go to the supermarket like this. I think that's a great idea. I might well go to Aldi tomorrow dressed like this. I think that would be quite an excellent idea. And maybe, you never know, I might inspire some young girls to go and become pilots. If anyone stops me, that's what I'll tell them that I'm trying to urge them to do. So on that merry note, I actually must fly because I'm setting off on a round the world trip tonight with my very own navigator, and hopefully you will be hearing from me in a few days' time. Just getting my navigation ready. I'm hoping that the navigator hasn't fallen asleep. Oh, is that the right map, or is that the one in Tenerife? I'm not totally sure. But thanks so much for joining me. If you want, you can sponsor me on Ko-fi.com. And if you go there, you can keep me in outfits, makeup and books. And I will see you next week for a topic to be decided. And that will be in 2022. Thanks so much for joining me this evening. And good night. See you soon. Bye.